The face you see in the mirror is merely a finely painted masterpiece of deception. Welcome to my philosophy channel. This video may be long, but if you stay until the end, you may finally understand why you feel incomplete, why love fails, and why the person you believe you are might be an illusion. We will explore the depths of human consciousness and uncover the hidden forces that secretly dictate every single decision you make. Chapter 1: The Illusion of the Self. We wander through our daily existence, truly believing that we possess complete control over our actions and deepest desires. We construct elaborate narratives about our core identity, assuming that the voice speaking inside our head represents the absolute truth of our being. Yet, Carl Jung dedicated decades to proving that this perceived conscious control is merely a fragile surface layer. Beneath this carefully constructed facade exists a vast and terrifying ocean of hidden desires, repressed memories, and unconscious impulses. Most individuals traverse their entire lives, entirely unaware that invisible forces dictate their most crucial decisions. They mistake their social mask for their true face, constantly performing for an audience that only exists within their own anxious imagination. From a very early age, you were systematically trained to hide specific fragments of your innate personality. You learned quickly what behaviors would secure comforting approval and which authentic expressions would provoke immediate rejection. Consequently, you began to methodically amputate parts of your soul, shoving them into the darkest corners of your mind just to ensure social survival. This relentless process of self-mutilation creates a beautiful but utterly hollow shell that Jung identified as the persona. This fabricated identity functions as a necessary shield to navigate the complex hierarchies of human society. However, the ultimate danger arises when you forget that you are merely wearing a protective mask and begin to fully identify with it. When you become entirely trapped within this socially acceptable character, a profound sense of meaningless emptiness inevitably emerges. You may achieve tremendous financial success or cultivate a flawless reputation, yet you will still feel completely disconnected from reality. This lingering numbness represents your repressed authentic self, desperately crying out from the unconscious depths, demanding to be seen and acknowledged. To awaken from this comfortable illusion requires immense courage, because the truth threatens everything you have carefully built. You must systematically dismantle the false identity that has provided you with safety and interpersonal validation. Only by piercing through the deceptive veil of the persona can you begin the terrifying journey toward discovering who you actually are beneath the surface. The prison that confines you is built entirely from your own desperate need to be acceptable. True growth often disguises itself as absolute destruction. Chapter 2: The Collapse of Meaning. The year 1913 marked a terrifying turning point for Carl Jung, plunging him into a severe psychological crisis. At 38 years old, he occupied the absolute pinnacle of his career. He was widely celebrated as the crown prince of psychoanalysis and Sigmund Freud's most promising disciple. Yet, beneath this pristine professional exterior, a profound spiritual chasm was rapidly expanding between the two thinkers. Freud was a brilliant pioneer, but he demanded absolute intellectual obedience from his devoted followers. He obsessively reduced every complex spiritual yearning to mere sexual repression and biological instinct. Jung began to sense that the human soul was far too vast and mysterious to be confined within such rigid dogma. blindly following Freud meant mutilating his own innate understanding of deepest psychological truths. The break between master and apprentice was not merely a polite academic disagreement. It was a violent tearing of two distinct souls, a monumental clash between different ways of perceiving existence. When Jung refused to bow to Freud's authoritarianism, he was excommunicated from the very community he helped build. This brutal isolation stripped away his professional identity and plunged him into total inner chaos. What happens to the human mind when the foundational meaning of its existence suddenly evaporates? Without the comforting structure of Freud's theories to anchor him, Jung's own carefully constructed defenses began to crumble. He found himself standing entirely alone, on the terrifying edge of mental collapse. The conscious control he relied upon, as a respected doctor, completely vanished, leaving him defenseless against his own subconscious. During the waking hours, profoundly disturbing hallucinations began to bleed into his normal, everyday reality. The distinct boundary between sanity and madness began to dissolve before his very eyes. He heard disembodied voices whispering in the silence and saw bizarre images flashing violently before his conscious vision. The rational mind he had spent decades perfecting was now actively mutinying against him. Nighttime brought absolutely no relief, delivering only deeper horrors from the darkest recesses of the mind. Jung was repeatedly tormented by vivid nightmares of massive floods, entirely submerging the civilized continent of Europe. He dreamed of frozen seas filled with blood and countless floating corpses, symbolizing impending destruction. He truly believed he was descending into the inescapable abyss of unrecoverable schizophrenia. This is the exact psychological void where most human beings suffer a complete break. When faced with such terrifying disintegration, the natural instinct is to seek desperate methods to numb the pain. Ordinary people employ iron logic, heavy medication, or willful denial to repress these disturbing hallucinations back into darkness. We are socialized to eradicate the symptoms of madness rather than daring to listen. Jung recognized a profound truth that would ultimately change the entire course of modern psychology. He understood that running from the approaching internal storm would only guarantee his ultimate destruction. He realized that terrifying symptoms of madness might actually be the disguised language of the suppressed soul trying to communicate. He reached a monumental crossroads that every courageous human being must eventually face. You can either desperately cling to the shattered fragments of your old illusions, or you can willingly step into the terrifying unknown. To save his own mind, Jung chose not to flee from his hallucinations, nor to medicate them into silence. Instead, he made the radical decision to turn around and walk directly into the dead center of his own mental storm. To find the ultimate truth, one must first willingly survive the complete annihilation of meaning. The deepest truths are never found in the light. They are always hidden safely within the terrifying dark. Chapter 3. The Descent into the Unconscious. To combat his looming madness, Jung invented a highly dangerous psychological technique that he later called active imagination. Instead of desperately repressing his terrifying hallucinations, he willingly relaxed his conscious control and allowed the deep unconscious to freely surface. It was exactly like standing deliberately on the edge of a bottomless abyss and consciously choosing to jump into the unknown. He meticulously recorded every single bizarre vision, profound dialogue, and terrifying emotional experience that emerged from the shadows. He painted these intense psychological encounters using magnificent calligraphy and elaborate illustrations within a massive leather-bound volume. This monumental psychological work would eventually become known to the entire world simply as the Red Book. This harrowing descent consumed exactly 17 years of his life. During the bright daylight hours, he continued to function perfectly as a highly respected medical doctor and a devoted family man. However, when the night finally fell, he immediately retreated into his private study to willingly battle the demonic forces residing within his own mind. In his deepest visions, he saw himself walking entirely alone through a desolate desert beneath a bleeding red sky. It was deep within this brutal and unforgiving psychological landscape that he first encountered autonomous inner figures possessing their own hidden agendas. He met an ancient prophet named Elijah, who represented divine spiritual wisdom, accompanied by a blind maiden named Salome. She embodied dark, seductive desires and the unpredictable dangers of raw, human instinct that remain completely untamed by civilized society. Jung quickly realized that the human soul always contains these terrifying opposites existing simultaneously within the exact same psychological space. The wise inner prophet conveyed one absolute directive that would forever alter the trajectory of modern psychology. You must willingly descend, he instructed Jung. That modern humans falsely believe they can only find truth by constantly climbing upward toward the rational light. We exhaust ourselves desperately chasing societal success, intellectual superiority, and moral purity while completely ignoring the dark roots of our own being. Jung discovered that you cannot simply accept the beautiful half of your existence while willfully discarding the remainder. To become truly whole, you must have the immense courage to face the unseen monsters lurking quietly within your own private hell. This terrifying descent into the psychological underworld forces us to confront the utter fragility of our carefully constructed rational minds. It brutally strips away our social pretenses and demands that we finally acknowledge our deepest unspoken insecurities. Are you truly prepared to abandon the safe illusion of who you think you are to discover who you actually need to become? You cannot reach the heavens until your roots have pierced completely through hell. What you hide from the world eventually becomes the invisible hand that guides your fate. Chapter 4. The Shadow. Within the deepest recesses of every human soul lies a hidden reservoir of darkness that Carl Jung identified as the shadow. This is not a collection of external evils, but rather the accumulation of every trait, desire, and impulse you have deemed unacceptable. From your earliest childhood, you were taught to excise your anger, your selfishness, and your raw ambitions to secure social belonging. However, these amputated fragments of your being do not simply vanish into the void once they are repressed. Instead, they retreat into the unconscious mind, where they ferment and gather, a terrifying level of autonomous power. The more desperately you try to project an image of moral perfection to the world, the more volatile and dangerous your hidden shadow becomes. Have you ever wondered why you occasionally experience sudden, uncontrollable bursts of rage that seem entirely alien to your character? Or why you feel an intense, irrational hatred towards certain individuals for flaws? You claim not to possess yourself. These are not random emotional glitches, but rather the shadow asserting its dominance over your carefully controlled conscious identity. Jung observed that when you willfully deny your own capacity for darkness, you effectively hand over the steering wheel of your life to a monster. By refusing to acknowledge your hidden cruelty or greed, You ensure that these forces will eventually manifest in destructive, unconscious ways. You become a puppet to the very desires you have spent your entire life trying to eradicate. Modern civilization is built upon the fragile illusion that we can construct a society of perfectly rational and benevolent beings. We repeatedly attempt to educate away our primal instincts, believing that science and logic can permanently neutralize the darkness within. Yet, Jung warned that a civilization that only values the light will inevitably be consumed by its own massive, unacknowledged collective shadow. Most individuals live in perpetual fear of their own internal depths, terrified of what might be discovered beneath the surface. They cling to the comforting lie of their own inherent goodness, unaware that this denial is exactly what makes them so easily manipulated. To be truly strong is not to be without darkness, but to have fully explored and mastered your own capacity for evil. The shadow functions as a mirror, constantly reflecting everything you secretly despise about yourself back into your conscious reality. It forces you to confront the uncomfortable truth that your identity is far more complex and contradictory than you care to admit. Only by looking directly into this mirror can you begin to reclaim the fragmented pieces of your true, authentic self. We are never more controlled than when we believe we are completely pure. We are never more blind than when we are absolutely certain of another person's hidden flaws. Chapter 5. Projection. Have you ever wondered why certain individuals trigger an instant and overwhelming sense of unexplainable hatred within you? You might believe that your visceral reaction is entirely justified by their apparent flaws or irritating behaviors. Yet, Carl Jung made a terrifying discovery regarding the exact nature of this intense psychological repulsion. You are rarely responding to the actual human being standing directly in front of your physical eyes. Instead, you are experiencing a devastating psychological mechanism that Jung accurately labeled as unconscious shadow projection. When you forcefully repress specific traits within your own identity, those traits demand expression externally. Your subconscious mind operates like a hidden projector, casting your denied darkness onto the faces of other people. You genuinely believe you are seeing their flaws while blindly staring at your own disowned and unacknowledged reflection. This invisible mechanism secretly destroys more intimate relationships and marriages than actual physical infidelity or financial ruin ever could. If you stubbornly refuse to acknowledge your own deep insecurities, you will suddenly begin seeing your partner as endlessly needy and clingy. If you secretly harbor an unacknowledged desire to control others, you will become absolutely convinced that your partner is constantly attempting to manipulate and dominate you. The most dangerous aspect of this psychological distortion is the absolute certainty it generates within your conscious mind. You do not feel like you are inventing a narrative. You feel like you are uncovering an objective truth. You freely interpret their innocent silence, slight tonal shifts, and mundane choices as irrefutable proof of malicious intent. Your brain willingly constructs an entirely fabricated reality just to protect your fragile ego. Once a powerful projection has firmly taken root, it becomes completely immune to any form of rational contrary evidence. Your partner could spend years desperately proving their genuine loyalty through consistent actions and countless loving sacrifices. Yet, your projected shadow will simply twist their genuine efforts into further evidence of a highly sophisticated manipulation tactic. You become entirely trapped inside a locked house built from your own repressed paranoia. This relentless projection inevitably cultivates a pervasive victim narrative that effectively shields you from taking any emotional responsibility. You conveniently cast yourself as the perpetual innocent suffering bravely at the hands of selfish and cruel tormentors. When you constantly feel victimized by everyone around you, you must seriously question your own internal landscape. The common denominator in every single one of your disastrous interpersonal conflicts is always you. Jung identified disproportionate emotional intensity as the clearest warning sign of an active and volatile shadow projection. If someone commits a minor offense and you experience a monumental surge of apocalyptic rage or utter betrayal, pay close attention. That explosive reaction is never actually about their insignificant transgression. It is your own suppressed inner darkness violently erupting because it finally found a convenient external target to viciously strike. The projector often attempts to validate their distorted reality by actively recruiting external witnesses into their delusional framework. They will passionately share their carefully constructed grievances with friends, pointing to tiny behaviors as absolute proof of guilt. They need other people to agree with their assessment in order to sustain the heavy illusion and avoid deep reflection. Ultimately, the innocent target finds themselves completely isolated and brutally gaslighted. To escape this destructive cycle requires the agonizing process of withdrawing your bitter projections from the external world. When you feel that overwhelming urge to harshly condemn another human being, you must immediately stop and look inward. Ask yourself the terrifying question of whether you actually possess the very trait you are violently attacking. Acknowledging your own capacity for deceit is the only antidote to endless interpersonal warfare. When you finally stop using other people as convenient mirrors for your own unacknowledged inner demons, reality substantially changes. You suddenly see the beautiful and flawed human beings standing before you without the corrupting filter of your insecurities. You realize that much of the cruelty you perceived in the world was secretly originating from within. True empathy only becomes possible when you have forgiven the monster inside yourself. The enemy you relentlessly hunt in the outside world has always been waiting patiently inside your own house. A mask worn for too long eventually becomes the only face you recognize. Chapter 6: Persona. From the very first moments of your conscious social existence, you were enlisted into a lifelong theatrical performance. Carl Jung identified this elaborate act as the persona, the highly curated mask you wear to secure approval and survive within human society. This fictional character is not inherently evil. It is an absolute necessity for navigating the complex hierarchies of civilized life. Yet the inherent danger arises when you forget that you are only playing a role. During your most vulnerable early years, you quickly discovered exactly which behaviors evoked warm affection and which provoked cold rejection. To guarantee your emotional survival, you began to systematically hide the unacceptable fragments of your soul while artificially amplifying the traits that society rewarded. You constructed a polished version of yourself specifically designed to be loved, admired, and welcomed by the tribe. However, this strategic adaptation required the tragic sacrifice of your raw, authentic nature. Consider the exhausting hypervigilance required to maintain this pristine illusion during every single interpersonal interaction throughout your day. You constantly monitor your words, censor your natural reactions, and meticulously hide any flaw that might shatter your carefully crafted image. That pervasive sense of unrelenting fatigue you often feel is simply your persona operating on massive overdrive. You are bleeding your own vital life force just to sustain a hollow avatar that does not actually exist. Nowhere is this psychological mutilation more evident than within the brutal and unforgiving arena of modern corporate culture. You walk into the office and immediately don the smiling, agreeable, and endlessly productive mask required for professional advancement. You swallow your valid frustrations, nod politely at unreasonable demands, and project an unwavering enthusiasm that you secretly despise. This corporate persona demands utter obedience, slowly erasing the boundary between the worker and the suppressed human being. Perhaps even more dangerous is the cultivation of the supremely moral or overly spiritual persona. Individuals who desperately need to be perceived as boundlessly forgiving or endlessly generous are often hiding terrifying amounts of repressed resentment. By refusing to acknowledge their own capacity for anger or selfishness, they become slaves to the expectation of their own fabricated sainthood. This righteous mask ultimately transforms genuine human goodness into a suffocating and manipulative prison of social obligation. This psychological masquerade becomes especially devastating when you carry your polished persona into the sacred realm of romantic relationships. You believe you are delivering your best self, but you are actually presenting a flawless actor dictating from a pre-written script. The tragic consequence is that your partner deeply falls in love with the shining mask, while the real human being beneath remains completely invisible. You have successfully manufactured adoration, but you have ensured absolute inner loneliness. Jung warned that any relationship built exclusively upon two interacting personas is merely a mutually agreed upon theatrical illusion. Both individuals silently agree never to acknowledge the frightening darkness or the ugly flaws residing safely behind their partner's glowing facade. They perform their designated roles flawlessly, ensuring that true intimacy is permanently blocked by an impenetrable wall of manufactured perfection. Underneath this beautifully choreographed dance, both souls slowly wither from a profound and unspoken starvation. Eventually, the heavy mask must inevitably slip, because the repressed authentic self absolutely demands to breathe sometime. The collapse rarely happens with a grand cinematic explosion. It usually begins with a tiny, uncharacteristic crack during a moment of extreme stress, a sudden burst of cruelty, an unexplainable betrayal, or a cold retreat leaves the bewildered partner immersed, staring in utter disbelief. The flawless illusion instantly shatters, revealing a terrifying stranger standing right where a trusted lover used to be. When the mask finally falls, all the hidden selfishness, repressed neediness, and denied darkness instantaneously erupt to the surface. The partner does not understand why. Their perfect spouse has suddenly transformed into an entirely different and threatening entity. They genuinely believe they have been cruelly deceived, unaware that they had willingly participated in loving a ghost all along. This violent unmasking destroys the relationship precisely because the foundation was constructed entirely upon a comfortable and beautiful lie. We currently exist in a modern consumer society that actively encourages and heavily profits from the endless cultivation of false personas. Social media platforms function as global theaters where billions of anxious individuals desperately perform for unseen and indifferent audiences. We have collectively replaced genuine human connection with the cold, algorithmic validation of carefully selected highlight reels. We are all slowly suffocating beneath the heavy weight of our own relentless and highly filtered perfection. To begin the painful process of individuation, you must first have the immense courage to slowly lower this shielding mask. You must willingly disappoint those who only love the fictional character you have carefully created for their exclusive comfort. Removing the persona is utterly terrifying because it leaves you entirely exposed to potential rejection and unforgiving social scrutiny. Yet, it is the only possible path toward discovering a reality where you no longer have to constantly hide. Living without the shield of the persona requires you to embrace the full spectrum of your awkward, contradictory, and messy humanity. It means accepting that you will not be universally loved, but you will finally experience the profound peace of being genuine. You must choose between the exhausting safety of universal approval and the dangerous freedom of authentic existence. You can never truly be loved until you are willing to be entirely seen. What we call love is often just a desperate search for our own missing pieces. Chapter 7. Love as Psychological Projection. Carl Jung made a terrifying discovery regarding the universal human desire to love and be loved. He realized that this profound yearning is rarely about establishing a genuine connection with another independent human being. Instead, it is a deep psychological attempt at complete self-completion. You are not actually searching for your missing soulmate wandering somewhere out in the vast world. You are desperately searching for the reflection of the fractured parts you have rejected within yourself. When you feel that magnetic attraction toward a stranger, your subconscious is actually recognizing your own denied traits upon their face. This revelation frightened many patients because it completely shatters the romantic illusion. Every new relationship secretly becomes a terrifying confrontation with your own shadow. Most individuals enter romantic relationships wearing an elaborately constructed social mask known as the persona. You meticulously hide your deepest flaws, desperately attempting to appear perfectly worthy of receiving absolute affection. You carefully modulate every single word and suppress every negative reaction just to prevent painful rejection. Consequently, the partner falls deeply in love with a brilliant actor rather than a genuine human being. You can only sustain this exhausting performance for a limited duration before the heavy mask inevitably cracks. When the pristine facade finally slips, all the hidden anger, extreme selfishness, and desperate neediness violently erupt. The partner suddenly feels deeply betrayed by someone they realize they never actually knew. This is exactly why so many seemingly perfect relationships mysteriously and suddenly collapse into absolute ruin. Beyond the fragile persona exists an even more destructive force known as shadow projection. This invisible mechanism ruthlessly destroys marriages when you unconsciously blame your partner for your own disowned darkness. If you secretly harbor a desire to manipulate, you become convinced that your partner is constantly scheming against you. You create a fabricated reality that remains completely immune to any rational contrary evidence. You sincerely believe your distorted perceptions and relentlessly cast yourself as the perpetual, helpless victim. Your subconscious actively ignores their genuine efforts, interpreting everything through the toxic filter of your own repressed flaws. True love cannot possibly survive where one person is constantly boxing with their own internal demons. You are essentially attacking a mirror for displaying your own unflattering reflection. The individuals most vulnerable to this vicious psychological weapon are often highly sensitive and deeply empathetic partners. Because they possess a remarkable ability to perceive hidden emotional pain, they inadvertently trigger the projector's fierce defenses. The projector subconsciously attacks the empathetic partner precisely because they desperately fear being exposed. The empath absorbs all the denied toxicity, slowly withering away under the unrelenting blame. To build a genuine connection requires the brutal honesty of complete shadow integration from both individuals. You must, first, willingly acknowledge your own capacity for profound selfishness, intense cruelty, and desperate neediness. When you finally accept your entire humanity, you stop demanding that your exhausted partner serve as your psychological savior. Only two complete and independent individuals can form a bond free from delusional manipulation. We search the entire world for love, blind to the fact that we only find ourselves. Kindness without boundaries is merely fear disguised as virtue. Chapter 8. The Danger of False Spirituality. In contemporary society, we have falsely equated spiritual awakening with endless pacifism and absolute compliance. We are told that a truly evolved soul must forgive every transgression, accommodate every toxic demand, and absorb every drop of negativity without complaint. Yet, Carl Jung recognized this perpetual niceness not as high spiritual attainment, but as a dangerous psychological trap. This is not true kindness. This is the absolute surrender of your sovereign self. Consider the individual who willingly functions as the emotional dumping ground for every friend and colleague. They proudly wear their exhaustion as a spiritual badge of honor, believing their constant sacrifice makes them morally superior. However, beneath this beautiful facade of selfless empathy lies a terrifying inability to establish firm boundaries. They are desperately purchasing social approval, using pieces of their own soul as the frighteningly high currency. When you smile at a disrespectful boss or endure an abusive partner under the guise of spiritual forgiveness, you are not healing them. You are systematically training your own nervous system to accept utter degradation as a reasonable price for connection. You rationalize your submission by claiming everyone deserves compassion, while conveniently forgetting that you also deserve fundamental respect. Your supposed spirituality has mutated into a perfect disguise for psychological cowardice. True spiritual awakenings never transform humans into weak, defenseless doormats willingly waiting to be crushed. Jung discovered that individuals who genuinely integrate their consciousness do not become easier to manipulate. They become absolutely impervious to emotional extortion. When someone attempts to burden them with unwarranted guilt, they remain entirely unmoved. They simply observe the manipulation attempt and calmly refuse to participate in the neurotic drama unfolding before their eyes. To possess genuine spiritual power means you retain the absolute capacity to walk away from destructive environments without offering endless justifications. You do not need to convince a toxic partner or manipulative friend that you are morally correct. You merely recognize the harmful dynamic, quietly gather your precious energy, and strategically detach. This strategic withdrawal terrifies weak individuals because they cannot leverage your false kindness to trap you any longer. Many people fear that establishing rigid boundaries will make them appear cold, cruel, or terribly unenlightened to the world. They dread the inevitable backlash from those who have comfortably profited from their long-standing silence and endless accommodations. Yet, setting a boundary is the most profound act of truth you can introduce into a broken relationship. It violently shatters the illusion of false harmony and forces both parties into absolute reality. A complete human being understands that anger and ruthlessness are sometimes necessary instruments for preserving sanity and personal integrity. A fully integrated soul knows exactly when to be infinitely gentle and precisely when to be utterly unforgiving. If you repress your protective anger because you believe it is unspiritual, you deactivate your vital psychological immune system. You cannot defend your inner citadel if you voluntarily surrender all your heavy weapons. A saint who cannot wield a sword is merely a victim waiting for the inevitable slaughter. To be perfect is a childish illusion. To be whole is a terrifying responsibility. Chapter 9. Individuation. Throughout your entire life, you have been relentlessly driven by a desperate desire to achieve absolute perfection. Society endlessly demands that you become completely flawless, purging every negative emotion and eradicating every undesirable trait. Yet, Carl Jung proposed a radically different and deeply challenging goal for the human soul. He declared that the ultimate objective of human existence is not achieving pristine perfection, but reaching absolute psychological wholeness. This profound transformation is known as the process of individuation. It is the agonizing journey of stripping away the societal mask and reclaiming every discarded fragment of your broken identity. You must deliberately walk back into the darkest corridors of your unconscious mind to retrieve your hidden shadow. True individuation requires you to forgive your own innate cruelty and willingly embrace the deepest flaws you have spent decades despising. We endlessly divide the world into brutal opposites, separating logic from emotion and purity from sin. We assume that becoming better simply means choosing the light and permanently destroying the dark. However, Jung discovered that rejecting half of your innate humanity only leads to severe psychological starvation and eventual collapse. You must harmonize these warring factions within yourself, allowing the angel and the demon to finally coexist in peace. During this monumental integration, you will eventually encounter the ultimate center of your entire being, which Jung called the self. The self is not your fragile ego or your carefully crafted social persona. It is the magnificent, infinite totality of both your conscious mind and your unfathomable, unconscious depths. To reach this sacred center, you must surrender your desperate need for total control and trust, the inner wisdom. This breathtaking psychological evolution is never a destination you can simply reach and permanently inhabit. It is a brutal, lifelong commitment to constant discovery, demanding unwavering honesty and relentless self-examination. When you finally become an integrated human being, you no longer react blindly to the chaotic world. You operate from a place of profound stillness, anchored completely by the heavy truth of your own, unbreakable internal wholeness. The greatest triumph is not conquering the world, but finally conquering your own fragmented soul. True influence is never demanded. It is silently surrendered to those who no longer need it. Chapter 10. Power and Psychological Sovereignty. We are constantly taught that spiritual awakening should make us endlessly accommodating and perpetually harmless. Society equates deep psychological growth with becoming a passive receptacle for the chaotic emotions of others. Yet, Jung discovered that genuine integration produces the exact opposite result within the human psyche. True awakening does not transform you into a vulnerable victim. It forges you into an absolutely untouchable and sovereign entity. Have you ever noticed how the most powerful individual in any room rarely raises their voice to demand attention? They do not desperately explain their intentions or frantically seek validation from the anxious crowd surrounding them. Their profound influence emanates directly from their absolute psychological independence and refusal to participate in neurotic games. Because they do not need the room to approve, the entire room subconsciously surrenders its authority. When you finally achieve psychological sovereignty, you master the dangerous and beautiful art of strategic detachment. This does not mean you become cold, apathetic, or entirely disconnected from human suffering. It means you can observe another person's complete emotional collapse without willingly allowing their chaos to infect your mind. You become a silent anchor in the raging storm, remaining completely unmoved by the desperate tides of external manipulation. Consider the desperate paradox of human relationships and interpersonal power dynamics. The individual who frantically needs a specific outcome is always the most vulnerable to exploitation and coercion. The moment you absolutely depend on someone else for your internal stability, you hand them the leash to your soul. Jung realized that true power belongs exclusively to the person who is genuinely prepared to walk away entirely empty-handed. To influence the world, you must first learn how to live in it without being consumed by its illusions. You can actively participate in corporate hierarchies or complex family dynamics while guarding your internal peace. You perform the necessary social roles flawlessly. Yet, you never mistake the temporary stage for absolute reality. You can speak profound truths without harboring any frantic emotional attachment to whether anyone actually listens. This level of independence terrifies weak individuals because they can no longer manipulate you through fear or false guilt. They will accuse you of being cruel, simply because your firm boundaries prevent it from feeding on your energy. You must stand absolutely resolute, knowing that your peace is infinitely more valuable than their comfort. You are no longer a prisoner seeking escape. You are the master of the key. We only control the world when we finally stop begging it to hold us. You cannot forge a masterpiece using only the lightest colors of the palette. Chapter 11. Integration of the Shadow. For decades, you have kept the most terrifying aspects of your human nature locked safely away in the cold basement of your subconscious. Society convinced you that your anger, your ruthless ambition, and your capacity for destruction were inherently evil traits, requiring absolute containment. Yet, Carl Jung made an astonishing revelation regarding this imprisoned darkness. He discovered that your deep shadow actually contains your most magnificent and vital life force. When you systematically repress your primal instincts, you simultaneously castrate your own creative genius and personal authority. The individual who is incapable of harboring any dangerous thoughts is not actually good. They are merely powerless. True morality only exists when you possess the absolute capacity for profound cruelty but make the conscious choice to withhold it. A harmless rabbit cannot claim to be peaceful simply because it cannot fight. To integrate your shadow means you must willingly walk down those dark mental stairs and finally unlock the heavy iron cage. You must look directly into the glowing eyes of your own repressed aggression and acknowledge it as an integral part of your native architecture. This frightening encounter is not intended to transform you into a monster, but to prevent the monster from silently driving your every decision. Consider the immense psychological energy required to constantly keep your inner demons heavily sedated and completely hidden from the public eye. You are bleeding vast amounts of your precious daily vitality just to maintain the pristine illusion of unwavering innocence. When you finally stop fighting your own internal nature, that massive expenditure of energy is instantaneously returned to you. You suddenly possess the raw fuel necessary for immense creation. Integrated individuals wield a unique and terrifying aura that weak people find both intoxicating and deeply unsettling, because they have made peace with their own capacity for destruction. They no longer fear the chaos of the external world. When you stop hiding from yourself, you simultaneously stop trembling before the judgments of others. You walk through society possessing the quiet, unshakable confidence of a predator resting peacefully in sunlight. This radical integration is the exact mechanism that forges genuine charisma and undeniable leadership within the human sphere. You cease being a fragile reflection of societal expectations and become a formidable force of authentic expression. People are naturally drawn to those who fully own their darkness, because it unconsciously grants others the permission to finally exhale. Your integrated completeness subconsciously heals the desperate fragmentation present within surrounding souls. Do you possess the absolute courage required to invite your most despised self to sit directly at your sacred dining table? Can you look at your own deepest shame, bitterest jealousy, and most visceral rage without flinching or demanding immediate eradication? This is the only path toward reclaiming your sovereign psychological throne. You cannot rule your internal kingdom while continuously banishing half of your native population into the cold. A weapon kept hidden in the dark controls the master. A weapon held firmly in the light protects the realm. To become whole is to finally stop fighting the universe residing within your own skin. Chapter 12, The Final State. Carl Jung understood that reaching the final state of individuation is never about arriving at a permanent state of flawless bliss. It is not a magical finish line where all human suffering mysteriously vanishes into thin air. Instead, it is the profound attainment of absolute psychological clarity. You finally cease being a helpless puppet violently pulled by the invisible strings of your own repressed childhood traumas. When you achieve this magnificent wholeness, you can simultaneously hold both the blinding light and the terrifying darkness without shattering. You no longer frantically flee from your own uncomfortable emotions or desperately project them onto innocent bystanders. You stand entirely sovereign, completely immune to the contagious hysteria and manufactured anxieties that relentlessly drive the unconscious masses. Your internal compass is finally calibrated to absolute truth. This brattering psychological evolution radically transforms the fundamental nature of every single relationship you maintain. Because you no longer desperately need another human being to complete your fragmented soul, you can finally experience genuine love. You do not search for a savior, and you absolutely refuse to become a willing martyr for someone else. Two complete individuals can finally meet in absolute truth rather than mutual delusion. However, bearing the heavy burden of complete consciousness in a world that relentlessly prizes comfortable blindness requires immense fortitude. You will clearly see the hidden manipulations driving modern society and the silent desperation controlling your closest friends. You must cultivate profound compassion to observe their utter unconsciousness without attempting to forcefully awaken them. True wisdom knows exactly when to speak and precisely when to remain silent. you eventually realize that the entire fabric of civilized society is merely an elaborate psychological game played by anxious souls. Because you have successfully detached from your social persona, you can flawlessly play your designated role without believing the fictional script. You possess the ultimate freedom to act brilliantly upon the stage while always remembering that you are actually the silent observer watching from the empty theater. The harrowing journey down into the terrifying depths of the human unconscious ultimately returns you directly back to the surface. You do not escape from mundane reality into some ethereal spiritual realm, but rather you inhabit the physical world with unprecedented vitality. You have faced the most fearsome monsters residing within your own mind, and have successfully extracted their tremendous power to fuel your own living masterpiece. Thank you for journeying through the complex labyrinth of Carl Jung and the deepest corridors of human psychology on my Philosophy channel. If this exploration into the shadows of the human mind brought you value, please like this video and subscribe for more deep content. We must continue to deconstruct the hidden psychological forces that secretly shape our perceptions, drive our desires, and architect our shared reality. If everything you believe about yourself is merely a carefully constructed social illusion, then who is the entity actually listening to these words?